Okay, we are back with the second video as we are talking about the seven churches again, a little bit more in depth. And we are starting with Smyrna on here. We'll see how far we get as we're talking about Smyrna. So Smyrna is considered entitled the persecuted church. The church at Smyrna was a church in pain and suffering because of the persecution of their Christian faith at this point. And as we look at this, the historical prophetic is the persecuted church. And this is put into the category of the Roman persecution, which was about 100 AD to about 300 AD. And that's kind of the slot that they were put in there. Now, they had some strengths, and Jesus had some concerns with them. Their strengths overall was that they were faithful amid poverty and persecution. It's interesting with the church at Smyrna. Remember how I was telling you that the pattern that Jesus used is that he would compliment the church, and then he kind of had a concern, and he would call the church. He would have a concern, and then he would call them to repentance, and then give them a promise, basically. So the strengths of the Smyrna church was that they were faithful amid poverty and persecution. Jesus did not have any concerns with them that we will see. And he calls them to be faithful unto death, and the promise was a crown of life, and that no harm would come to them from the second death. So, as we read this, Revelation 2, verse number 8, Jesus says, to the angel of the church in Smyrna. Now, when he talks about the angel, this could be an angelic messenger that ministered to these seven churches, or more likely, it's thought that whenever he talks about the angel, that he's talking about the actual pastor of the church of Smyrna. So he says, to the angel of the church in Smyrna, write, these are the words of the first and the last, who died and returned to life. That's going to be important in a little bit. Verse number 9, he says, I know your affliction and your poverty, though you are rich, and I am aware of the slander of those who falsely claim to be Jews, but are in fact a synagogue of Satan. Verse number 10 says, do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison to test you, and you will suffer tribulation for 10 days. So this prophetic thing is coming to the church of Smyrna, and Jesus is saying this to them. But he says, be faithful even unto the end, and I will give you a crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who overcomes will not be harmed by the second death. Now, the city of Smyrna was a profitable city, and it was about 40 miles north of Ephesus, and today it's called Izmir. And because of its natural harbor, it became an important stop on the east to west trade route. It was named for its chief export. And the chief export, and I told you in the teaching, when we say Smyrna, I had everybody say it like this, Smyrna. I don't know if you remember that or not. And so what is the chief export? The chief export is myrrh. Yes, of the gold, frankincense, and myrrh era of the three kings bringing the gifts to Jesus, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And Smyrna took care of myrrh. And it was a seaport. It was known for its flowers and its fragrance. If you can imagine stepping back in time in the first century, I'm sure that when you walked into Smyrna, that you could tell the scent of the flowers. It was it's kind of interesting, because if you've ever been to Hawaii, and Jeannie and I have been a couple of times, but for instance, like when we would go to Maui and you would get off the plane, you could smell the scent of the orchids and all of the fragrant tropical flowers and things. And of course, they would come and they would put leis on you and welcome you to Hawaii. And we got used to that. And I'm sure that Smyrna was very much like that. It was a tropical climate. It had beauty, and so it was very aromatic. And they made this aromatic resin that they used in perfume that released beautiful scents when crushed. And that's really what the myrrh was all about. And the city was filled with Greek pride and Roman arrogance. Because what had happened, when we look back in the history of it, about 600 BC, King Attila devastated this region, right? Alexander the Great comes in and rebuilds Smyrna into a spectacular city of its day. It's the concept of going from death to life, from decimation to resurrection. And that's the theme that Jesus picks up on when he's talking to the people of Smyrna. Death to life, devastation to resurrection. And because of myrrh was like an embalming type of a fluid, ritual, resin, aromatic scent. That's why the kings brought it to Jesus. The gold, the frankincense, the myrrh. And it was used in this burial process there. So it was valued to use in the burial and fragrance, myrrh was. And they produced it, and they sold the most myrrh in the world. Okay? Jesus was saying to the people at Smyrna, you are going to be resurrected to a far better life. And he addresses himself when he talks to the church at Smyrna. He says, I am the one who has died and risen again. And so he relates that to them because they were in the death industry of producing this myrrh. And Jesus says, I know your tribulation. And the term in the original Greek means to be crushed. The word tribulation here is a picture of the ancient torture that the Romans would do sometimes, and they would stretch a person out and tie them to a particular thing, and they would begin to put weights on their chest. And they would continue to build the weights more and more and more until it would begin to crush the person's chest and they couldn't breathe anymore. And that's the way that they would execute them. See, the Romans made a cottage industry out of torture and killing people. It was a way of life. It was nothing for people who came into a particular city to have Roman crosses with crucifixion and people hanging all over the place. It would be like when you and I had experienced, or we experienced in our country, maybe you didn't particularly experience it, but ritual hangings, I think of the movie with Clint Eastwood, Hang 'em High. Somebody would steal your horse and you'd string them up, right? And this was the way that the Roman culture was. Torture was a cottage industry for them. And it was not unusual to see crucifixions all over the place. People that were enemies of the state, people who had done something, and so they would just hang them out in public, naked, on a cross, like Jesus. They would crucify him. Can you imagine living in a culture that way? With your kids, trying to go from one place to another, and here's all these people that are suffering and dying or dead on the roads as spectacles. And they would gather in the Colosseums and the Circus Maximus, and they would have gladiator wars to the death, and especially the persecution of the Christians, horrendous things. There's an old story, old book that I read when I was a kid called The Martyr of the Catacombs. If you can ever get a hold of that. Interesting. It's a fictional story, but it's kind of based on some reality, and talks about that. There's also another book that is a real book called Fox's Book of Martyrs. And if you think that you and I go through persecution in America because somebody is nasty to us in the break room at work because we're a Christian, read Fox's Book of Martyrs and get a wake-up call of exactly what these early Christians in the first century went through. And Jesus is talking to the church at Smyrna and saying, I know that you're going through persecution, and I know that you're going through tribulation. You're going through being crushed, like the picture of the man stretched out with weights on his chest. Jesus says, I know. Don't ever think that the Lord doesn't know what you're going through. You know, it's like when we come alongside someone, and I'm, right now, most of you know, I'm working on my master's of psychology and counseling at this point. And we talk a lot about the ministry of presence. That when you and I go through hard stuff, maybe we're going through the death of a loved one or something like that, or the death of a child, it's like, what do you say to somebody that has experienced that? Or somebody who's gone through a murder in their family or a suicide. What do you say? Sometimes you just don't have the words. And so we talk about in counseling and in psychology the ministry of presence, of just coming and just sitting and just being there. And maybe not even saying anything, maybe not even having the words, because you and I don't have the answers a lot of times. But sometimes we can put our arm around somebody and we're going to pat them on the shoulder and we're going to say, I know. And that's exactly what Jesus is saying to the church at Smyrna. I know what you're going through. I've been persecuted. I was crucified. I died. I rose again. I know the tribulation that you're going through. And so you and I, sometimes you're thinking sometimes in our Christian walk, you know what? I just can't catch a break. I can't catch my breath. I can't go through this. And Jesus is saying, I know. I know what you're going through. I know where you are. And sometimes it's the ministry of his presence, of just knowing that Jesus is there. He says, I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you, because I know, right? And he says to the church at Smyrna, he said, I know that you're going through poverty. I know that you're going through slander. I know that you're going through imprisonment and death. I know. That's what he says. You see, taking a stand for Christ in Smyrna could mean that you would lose everything. We try to prepare for disasters in our lives. Maybe you have a bank account, maybe you have a retirement account or something. But there are a great deal of people, and there are a great deal of us that live from paycheck to paycheck. And when you lose your job, it can be devastating to you. When you can't pay your bills, you can't pay your rent, you can't pay your mortgage, you can't pay your car payment, you can't put food on the table, it devastates you. And Jesus was talking to the people at Smyrna, saying, I know your tribulation, and I know that if you take a stand for me, that you may go into being impoverished. And this is what it meant to the Christians in Smyrna. And they would lose these things simply because they were followers of Christ. They'd lose their job. They'd lose their status in the community. Status in the community was very big then. It's very big now. It's that shaming thing. You know, if you're falsely accused of something, and let's say you're falsely accused in the courts of law, and then later on you're exonerated and found not guilty, you still bear that scarlet letter that Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote about. You still bear that shame. You still feel like you're walking around and people are looking at you all the time. Well, I know what you did. I know what it said on the internet. I know what it said in the newspaper, you know, whatever. And the people at Smyrna would lose these things because they were followers of Christ. See, the thing in Smyrna was the trade unions, because they were a prosperous city. They manufactured myrrh, but they had the trade unions that were there. And every one of the trade unions had a god. Remember, this is the Roman culture. Roman providences, Greek culture, lots of gods. And every trade union had its own god. And so you would pay homage and you would worship those gods and the gods of the trade union. And when you became a Christian, you wouldn't worship those gods anymore. They'd kick you out of the union. You'd lose your job. You'd lose your livelihood because you wouldn't worship. What if it was like that now? You know, you work for General Motors, or you work for, the food industry or something like that. And because you stand up for the cause of Christ, they say, oh, yeah, you can't work here anymore. That's what's happened in Smyrna. They were slandered, they were belittled, they were made fun of. And what was it that Jesus said? He said, I know what you're going through. And if you were imprisoned in Smyrna for the cause of Christ, it was usually a rat-infested dungeon full of human excrement, very little light, and not much food. And you would be imprisoned because of the cause of Christ. Or you would die in the arenas. You'd be thrown to the wild beast in the public arena while the crowds cheered. Or maybe you'd be burned at the stake, or some other horrific way to die. This is what was going on in Smyrna. There were many Christian martyrs in Smyrna. One of the most famous was Polycarp, 86 years old. And they came to arrest him one day, and he was so hospitable that he fixed the people who came to arrest him a meal. And as they were going to arrest him, and after they ate the meal, now can you imagine what they were thinking? We're going to arrest this guy. They were used to coming in and arresting them, just taking people, dragging them out of their homes, throwing them in the dungeon, right? They came to arrest this guy, and he says, oh, okay, yeah, I'll go with you, but before we do, let's sit down and eat. You know, I got some pizza cooking, here. You care for a slice? And so they were like astonished, so they sat down to eat with him. And then he says, after they eat, he said, would it be okay, since you're arresting me, since you're going to throw me in the dungeon or whatever, can I pray for an hour before we do that? Now, he had just fed him a meal, right? And so they said, yeah, I guess that would be okay. And so he goes in the other room and he kneels down and he starts to pray. And his prayer was so intense, and they heard what he was saying, and he was probably asking forgiveness for these men that were coming to arrest him, and that Jesus would be with them and would bless their families and all of this kind of thing. By the time that he got done praying, after an hour, they were going, we can't kill this guy. we don't we don't want to arrest him. But nevertheless, it was going to be their death if they didn't do what they were supposed to do. So they take Polycarp and they take him before the magistrate. And he so ingratiates himself to the magistrate because of his Christian love that the magistrate says, I don't want to kill you, but all you have to do is just deny Christ. And the magistrate begged him to deny Christ. And Polycarp's answer is that he came back and he said, I've served my master for 86 years. I can't deny him now. So, unfortunately, they lead him out into the public arenas. They've got the stake there that they burn people at, and so they tied him up and they piled the wood around him and paper and whatever else that they do to set the thing on fire. And they set it on fire. It starts to burn. And before it starts to consume Polycarp, the wind came and blew out all the flames. The breath of God comes and extinguishes the flames. And finally, somebody in the crowd finally came up and stabbed him to death or whatever, and he died. He died for the purpose of Christ. But God used him as a testimony to bring multiple people to Christ, even in his martyrdom. And he came from Smyrna. And Jesus said to the Christians at Smyrna, I know your persecution, and I know what you're going through. And he said, I'm going to give you a crown of life because of what you're going through and because you love me, right? The symbol of the city of Smyrna was a crown. It was on all their buildings. It was on their coins. The Acropolis overlooked the city and had embattlements on the top that resembled a crown. And during the festivities, everyone wore a garland crown like the emperor. It was like laurel wreaths. You've seen pictures of it that was around, kind of the back of the head and all of that type of thing. And so they would have games like the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games are going on right now. And so as the Olympians would win certain things, they would receive this crown. And the crown was the symbol of the city of Smyrna. But if a person participated in the games and then it was found out that they were a Christian, they didn't receive a crown. They didn't get the laurel wreaths. They weren't honored. Not in Smyrna. They were not allowed to be honored. And so this time of horrendous persecution of the Christians in all of the different arenas in Rome, they were thrown to the lions, they were sewed up in bags, and everybody would watch wild beasts tear into the bags and tear into the people that were inside of them. They were burned at the stake while everybody cheered. This was a period of horrendous persecution. That's why it calls Smyrna the persecuted church. And one historian said that as many as 5 million Christians were slaughtered in the arenas. This is the type of oppression that the church at Smyrna lived under constantly. You and I in America have nothing going on like this. We think that we're persecuted because somebody says something to us, Somebody doesn't let us join their club, or somebody says, oh yeah, you're one of those Bible thumpers. Yeah. That was no persecution as compared to what was going on in Smyrna. But there was that connection between death and life because of Smyrna, because of the myrrh. And so Jesus said, yeah, I know what you're going through. He says, he who has the ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who overcomes will not be harmed by the second death. And he said to them also earlier, he said, I'm going to give you a crown of life. He said, you may not be recognized in the arenas. You may not be recognized in the city with the symbol of the city, with that crown, but I'm going to give you a crown. And he said also, for those of you who overcome are not going to be harmed by the second death. And as you look at this rang true with the Christians at Smyrna because they were ensconced in death. Their whole industry was death. Revelation 20, 14 and 15. We'll get to this a little bit later. But it says, then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone was found whose name was not written in the book of life, he was also thrown into the lake of fire. This is what Jesus is talking about when he's talking about the church at Smyrna, the second death. And I told you this in my other teaching. It's that old adage of, if you're born once, you die twice. But if you're born twice, you die once. So if you're born once and you don't receive Christ and be what we call born again, then you've got to die a physical death, but then you also die a spiritual death. So born once, die twice. But if you're born once and you die twice, on the other hand, if you are born twice, born physically, then you accept Christ and you're born spiritually, then you only have to die once. You only die the physical death. You don't die the second death that Revelation 20 talks about. You're not going to be cast into the lake of fire, which is the second death. And so Jesus was saying to the church at Smyrna, to the one who holds on to their faith, if you endure to the end, I'm going to give you that crown of life. I'm going to make sure that it's not the second death. And so he says to the church at Smyrna, hang in there and stay with it, and you're going to win. They had all of those things that were going. He says, I've been there. I know what it's like to be persecuted. I know what it's like to be impoverished. I know what it's like to be slandered and to suffer. He said, I'm the first and the last. I'll be there in the beginning and the middle and the end. And I know what you're going through. And that's what Jesus is saying to you, too. No matter what's going on in your life right now, and some of it might be horrendous, and you might be going through some things right now, you can take joy from the church at Smyrna, who also was persecuted. And Jesus wraps his arms around us and pats us on the back and says, I know what you're going through. But hang in there and stay with it, because you're going to win. So, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what Jesus is saying to the churches. So take comfort in that with those saints at Smyrna. We'll be back again, and the next one is Pergamum. See you then.